Well, welcome to May's Tenant Talk Live, everybody. If you just came in, feel free to continue introducing yourselves in the chat and where you're joining us from. Today's theme is on the impact of AI on tenant rights and housing access. For folks who might be new and I'm meeting for the first time on this call, my name is Sid and I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a project manager here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And again, you're currently joining Tenant Talk Live, and it's a meeting where we provide opportunities for tenants and residents across the country to connect with one another and share best practices for federal housing policies, but just housing advocacy in general and leading in your communities. Today we have a really great guest joining us, but before we get started with today's meeting, I'm going to provide some NLIHC updates, and then I'm going to give you some time to connect with one another in breakout rooms. So the first thing, as always, is going to be our community agreements. So let me put that on the screen really fast. All right, so just a reminder for everybody who might be new or who is still needs a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and it'll be put onto YouTube afterwards, so just be mindful of that. If you want to share anything, it'll be put out publicly afterwards. And then the number one rule that we have here is just the platinum rule, treating others the way they want to be treated. So in other words, just be considerate of how others want to be treated and how that might differ from how you want to be treated. And this rule differs from others because it rejects the idea that reciprocity is the norm and favors empathy and grace instead. And that's why we want to, build connections with one another. And that's why we do like the breakout rooms. Number two is we show respect to others by being considerate of our interactions and accountable for our actions. Number three is we listen actively with an open mind and empathy. We listen with intent to learn something of value from those who are sharing, and we are as attentive to and present with each other as possible. And four is we take up space and remember to give space to others to ensure everyone feels empowered to contribute to the conversation. And this includes muting your microphone when others are speaking. If you're not able to mute yourself in time, sometimes we'll catch you beforehand, so apologies if that happens. But those are our community agreements from earlier this year that we helped create together. If y'all have any like suggestions or any changes you want to see or any additions you want to see, feel free to email me those, please. But yeah. In addition, we'll be sending out materials, recap materials such as the notes or the chat, the recording, and all that stuff this upcoming Friday, May 9th. And you have to be signed up for our connection email. So if you're not signed up for NLIHC emails, you can do that at the link that we'll drop in the chat shortly. And our collective application is actually opening up soon. So for folks who don't know what the collective is, it's a dedicated group of tenant and community leaders with lived experience of housing insecurity, who work to advance housing and racial justice in their communities. And NLIHC works really closely with this group to make sure that our policy priorities reflect the needs of low-income renters. The application will be opening later this month, but if you're interested in receiving early access to it, we're actually having an interest form open right now because we know that there's a lot of interest and we want to make sure that we don't lose your information before the collective application comes out. So feel free to fill that interest form out. We just dropped it in the chat. And then lastly, again, just please remember to stay muted if you're not speaking, but if you have any questions or anything, feel free to use the chat so that you can ask your questions there. And before I hand it over to our guests, we're just going to be starting off today's call by giving everyone a quick chance to connect with one another and break the ice and build more of like a community-like setting for everyone. So we'll be putting you in breakout rooms of about 3 or 4 people, and you'll have about 10 minutes in this breakout. For today's prompt, I haven't had a chance to look at the chat, by the way, yet, so if I miss something, feel free to let me know. But for this month's breakout, we're going to be having a topic around Mental Health Awareness Month, since May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So if y'all feel comfortable sharing, and again, you don't have to, but I'll put that in the chat. What is one thing you can commit to doing for yourself before the end of the month? Oh, thank you, Kenza. But yeah, that'll be what you can cover in the breakout sessions, and we'll in the breakout rooms, and we'll start those shortly. And we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Awesome. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope some of y'all had a chance to connect with one another. I know sometimes it can be kind of finicky with the technology, but if there's one person that wants to share what they're doing for themselves this month, feel free to come off mute right now.
I hope it's okay to say this. It's more of a general comment that kind of helps people, you know. Hi, I'm Jenny Mohawk, you know, or Jennifer, one being professional, but Jenny Mohawk usually. Anyway, for this kind of advocacy work, everybody pretty much puts their heart into it, okay? And we all know about burnout, you know, where you just get whipped, you know, you're tired, all that. But there's also like worm's eye view, where like whatever you're working on, like for this or that issue or this or that community, you know, it kind of it wears on you to the point where you're kind of like, you know, this is it's always going to be like this. That's just the way it is and all that. But then it kind of helps you when you either kind of focus for take yourself out of what you're working on and look at some other issue or some other community, not just the big picture, but the details, because the devil's always in the details. It helps you bring, you know, kind of snap back, you know, to where you don't think, oh, you know, it's hopeless anymore. It's like, wait a minute, we're all looking at the same enemy, you know, and
Yeah.
it kind of helps to know that other people are fighting back too, even though they might be kind of working on different issues than you, or you know, but they're still with you. You know, they're still in the same effort with you. It's just a bigger effort, you know. Sometimes
Yeah.
it helps. I don't know. It helps me.
No, it's really helpful. Thank you, Jennifer. I think that also helps me stay grounded, and I feel like there might be a few folks on the call that also relate with that. And we also had one in the chat saying you know, prayer and affirmation for their mental health as well. So thank you both for sharing. But just so that we stay with the time, I'm now going to introduce our awesome guest for the day. Some of y'all might have met him in the breakout room, but joining us today, we have Dr. Michael Akinwumi. He is the Chief AI Officer and Rita Allen Fellow at the National Fair Housing Alliance. And he does a lot of great work. He has a lot of expertise around AI, so I'm really excited for you all to connect with him. He's really interested in innovating AI, but also making sure that there is you know, justice within it and that it's being equitable. So I look forward to hearing what he has to say. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to drop them in the chat.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Sydney. And I would say that I'm really excited to, speak with the group here because if I'm right, this is actually the one of the few or rare moments that I have the opportunity to talk to users or engage with people that are most likely going to be impacted by AI or algorithmic systems. So when NLIHC knocked on my door to speak on this, I said, wow, this is an opportunity that I really want to be part of. So that said, just briefly about the National Fair Housing Alliance. So we're a civil rights organization solely committed to eliminating any form of discrimination in housing and lending, and making sure that everyone has equal and equitable access to well-resourced communities. So within the organization, I lead our responsible AI effort or responsible AI lab under three work streams. And the first work stream is on innovation. So working on building, testing AI systems that are being used, for example, in marketing, tenant screening applications, or advertisement or mortgage underwriting to make sure that they comply with the law. And the second work stream that I lead within the lab is around governance. So how do we translate ethical values, ethical principles into practice? Because those people that are developing these systems, one of the questions we hear from them is how we can help them translate some of the principles that are required for their systems to behave in a responsible way, how we can help them translate it into practice. And the third work stream is around public trust, what we call AI trust. And I'm going to be speaking with you in that context today. So what we try to do is how can we center user experience or consumer experience around the use of AI in housing, lending, education, employment, health, and other related areas. But today I'm going to be talking to you about the impact of AI on tenant right and housing access, using some of the work we've done and we continue to do under tenant screening applications. And I'll try to draw from practical experience coming from some of the work we've done with organizations like Tech Equity Collaborative, Open Communities that are based in Chicago, Epic that is based in Washington, D.C., and other experience even from New Jersey and other areas. So, and I'm really hoping that this is going to be interactive. So one way that I like to evaluate my presentation is the level of engagement that comes after my presentation. But before I continue, again, I like to thank Sydney for reaching out and the NLIHC team for hosting this vital conversation, especially given the current federal political climate that is really important to the conversation we're trying to have. So again, I understand many of us here we're tenants or in one way or the other trying to advance tenant rights and also making sure that there's equitable access to housing. So one of the way that I like to think about AI is that it's actually comprised of, and when I say AI, I mean artificial intelligence. It's comprised of four components, and those components are the data that is driving the system. The second component is what we call the algorithm, but you can also call it the model, which learn from the data. And the third component is the infrastructure, like the data centers, the compute resources. And the fourth component is the users, because you may have AI systems in tenant screening. If nobody is using it or it's not making consequential decisions, then it's still just another experiment that you have in the lab. So my goal is to initiate a discussion on how algorithmic tools or AI-driven systems are impacting renters and home buyers nationwide, the risks that they pose, because I think if we want to center AI innovation and development around users, it's important that we bring to fore the user experiences. And I'll also try to wrap up by focusing on your role in advocating for fairer and more representative algorithmic systems in tenant training. So AI, if you ask me to predict or forecast what AI is going to look like in 5 years, I would say, especially in tenant screening application, it's just going to be like the air that we all breathe in and breathe out. In fact, if I ask you that, when was the last time you breathe in or breathe out, you probably will not even remember because that's something you do naturally. And I can tell you that that's what AI in tenant screening or housing is going to look like. So it's just going to be all around us. And we may not even know when or if or how AI is making or augmenting decisions that have consequences on how we live. For example, from tenant screening to rent setting, it's clear that algorithms, they are integral to decisions that determine who get housing and also the cost. So earlier on, I mentioned Tech Equity Collaborative, which is an organization that we've worked with on tenant screening applications and what they mean for users or for tenants. So there was a report that they published 2024 that says over 90% of large landlords in the US use algorithmic tenant screening tools to evaluate applicants. And if you think about that, that was just last year, 2024, right? So, and chances are that tenant, and if you just give me like 10 tenant, 9 out of them, they've been exposed to tenant screening application. And the tools or the algorithms, they analyze things like credit scores, eviction histories, even social media activity to predict what those that are developing or deploying them call risk. And in fact, because I've developed some of these models myself, I have a clear understanding of how they work. Ideally, what qualify as risk should be, tenants' ability to make their payment obligations, right? But there are a lot of instances where what is going on under the hood of the system is really about who pays what more than the others. In terms like they are now turning them into profit-making tools, which drives people out of communities, out of their neighborhoods. So, and when you hear that AI is being used to predict or forecast risk or one's ability to to make their monthly payment, on the surface, that seemed like efficient or efficiency. And I know I have to put the word efficiency in quotes. But the reality is that it's actually far more complex than efficient systems. Uh, Based on some of the work we've done, we realize that, for example, eviction histories, even credit scores, and some of those systems, they even rely on data that perpetuate historical inequalities in housing access. For example, the tech equity report that I referenced earlier shows that Black and Latino renters, they are disproportionately flagged as high risk due to systemic factors like wage gaps, limited credit access, and when we think about those that have thin credit files or those that are classified as unscorable, majority of them are African Americans or Black Americans and also Latino. And these are some of the reasons why one needs to be aware of how these systems are impacting tenant rights or access to housing. So if you want to just look at recent examples when it comes to tenant screening applications, the ones that we are familiar with and we've worked on. So cases like the rent growth case in DC. So last year, the DC Attorney General settled a lawsuit against a company called Rent Grow. And so the case was really about discriminatory practices where the algorithms disproportionately rejected Black and Hispanic applicants by relying on flawed data. And some of the data even included, criminal records or minor credit issues that could just be fixed if, the applicants had access to really identify the source or sources of the data. And, not being able to actually fix quality issues in the data is one of the major issues of systemic inequities that come with these AI systems. And not only that, these systems are now constituting gatekeeping against access to well-resourced communities. But if you also think about the case of RealPage, which is really involved in rent setting or price collusion, right? So this is a software company that many large landlords, including those covered in the tech equity collaborative that I referenced earlier. So it's come under scrutiny for its role in algorithmic rent setting. And it comes under different labels. For example, dynamic pricing, where as a prospective tenant, the rate you're going to see on the site, let's say in the morning, will be different from what you see in the evening or afternoon, just depending on some factors that we don't even know what is driving those factors. So that's one of the ways that AI or algorithms are actually impacting. Again, example of rate page. So the US, the DOJ, Department of Justice, they actually filed an antitrust lawsuit against rate page last year. And again, given the current administration, there is still much to be learned about what is going to happen to that lawsuit. And the allegation in the lawsuit that was filed last year is that RealPage software enabled landlords to collude and artificially inflate rents. And that's one of the ways that algorithm would have negative consequences on communities of color. Another instance that we're seeing when it comes to the use of AI in tenant screening applications is that not only that the data itself is really terrible, not only that these algorithms are being used to set prices, we actually see instances where landlords are leveraging deep fake algorithms. And deep fake here, these are algorithms that could create digital copies of real estate listings. And it's so difficult for prospective tenants to actually know which is real. And what they try to do is when they have multiple copies of a real listing, the algorithm that is used to set the price learn from a slight variation or differences in those digital copies and then use that again to inflate prices. So that's one of the ways that that's the third use case or instance that we're seeing. And you might be thinking that yourself as a tenant, what role can you play? And what I really like to share, what I always share with people is that, well, one, I'm lucky that I have a PhD and a PhD in math, but you don't need a PhD in math to ask questions about systems that impact you. So if you remember how I started the conversation before talking about real page example or rent grow example, I shared that in the lab that I lead, we focus on three areas: innovation, governance, and public trust or user trust or consumer trust, right? And when it comes to the issues of trust, you don't need any specialized knowledge about AI to ask simple questions. I remember, I think last year or a year and a half ago, when I was also in the market trying to rent an apartment. So I had to actually submit some information, and then they gave me like a tenant profile report or score. And I literally went through each of the sections in that report to see if I can ask questions about how they arrived at the decision. Now, the good thing was that the decision was not it was not an adverse decision or adverse action, right? Even though it was affirmative, I still wanted to know if there is anything I could have done differently or that the system could have done differently. And that's really the type of, that's the expectation that I have for you, that when it comes to the use of AI systems, the situation is not really completely hopeless. You don't need specialized knowledge to ask questions about some of these systems and how they may have consequences on how you conduct your daily business or how you live your life. So the question is, what can you do as a tenant? So I'm about to wrap up, given the time that I have. So I'm just going to, based on our field experience, also engaging with different communities, engaging with those that are developing these systems. I have about 3 to 4 recommendations that I would like to share with you. And I'm hoping that we can also use some of them to facilitate our discussion after my presentation. So the first thing is that you need to ask for transparency in tenant screening applications. So it is your right as a tenant to ask questions about how, for example, the automated tenant screening application arrive at a particular decision. And if it is a system that is being used to augment landlord's final decision or recommendation, same way that you call a human into question when some things are not clear, you can ask exactly the same questions. And usually, when you are asking for transparency, you may realize that some things are actually not right in the underlying data behind the system.
Transparency.
The second thing is that you actually need to advocate for stronger regulations. For example, Berkeley, they have ordinance against algorithmic price fixing in a model, and then we can actually build on that. So pushing for, asking for stronger regulations, sharing your own experiences or narratives would also compel some of our elective leaders to to do the right thing. And the third recommendation is that you can actually pressure landlords to adopt fairer screening practices based on the work that we do at the National Fair Housing Alliance. I can tell you that there are solutions that can be used to remove bias in tenant screening applications. And some of the solutions even include limiting the use of criminal records or providing appeal process that one can act on. So as tenants, you need to put pressure on your landlord so that they can adopt those screening practices that are known to be fair and also more accurate. And the last recommendation is that, I also encourage you to identify organizations that that have similar minds in terms of like goals, that have goals that unite you all together, and that includes organizations such as NLIHC, the National Fair Housing Alliance, and because that's how we can actually amplify our impact together. And I strongly believe that by working together, we can push for a housing system that prioritizes equity and access over profit. And with that, I've come to the end of my short remarks, and I'm really looking forward to taking any questions you may have.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. We did have a lot of questions come up in the chat, so I'm like copying and pasting them to the side as I get them. Hopefully we can get through most of them today, but if we can't, I'll make sure I'll follow up with everybody with your answers to them afterwards. But
Yeah, sure, definitely. So if we don't get through all of them, please, I'll be happy to actually provide our answer, and then you can help share that with the group here. So, but I'll let you moderate, and then you can ask questions. I'll be happy to answer.
yeah, so Rosie did have her hand up, so I can hand it over to Rosie, and then I can take some from the chat before going back to people online.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is just real quick. I'm gonna try to be quick because I got a lot I could say, but I won't. One of the things though that I noticed about the trends in AI is how it's advantageous to investors or property owners. One of the problems we have right now is that there's a variety of systems, algorithms, technology that tracks the tenant. There's almost none that tracks these property owners. So my question is, how do you think, aside from what you've already said, what type of trends do you see since you're involved in AI, where it's
Yeah.
balanced, where that it will benefit us, lay folk, regular folks, tenants, because the way it's set up now so far, it primarily benefits these investors. And I think we need a way, to kind of balance the scales. What do you think about that? And what have you seen as far as the technological trends in that direction? And thank you for taking my question.
No, 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 I'm glad you asked the question. So, when it comes to the role that private equity firms are actually playing, and even including some VCs, venture capitalists, the role that they are playing, again, the excellent work that Tech Equity Collaborative has done in that space is one useful resource or resources that will give you a sense of how some of these private investors are buying properties, or like I shared in my remarks, where you have 90% of the landlords that are considered to like major landlords relying on these systems and also using algorithms, right? So the trends we're seeing is that even when it comes to making decisions about what property to buy, looking at where the population is growing, they're actually using the private equity firms. They are using AI to also make that decisions. And I wish I could really tell you that as this is, for example, a nonprofit, an independent body that is probably building another um, objective tenant screening application, that let's say you have your draft report and then you can boom upload it to that platform just to make sure that you have comparative something to actually compare the decision with. But right now we're not at that stage yet. The trend, I mean, the trends that I'm actually seeing among nonprofit organizations and also third parties that are really interested in doing the right thing, it's about getting the data right first. First asking questions around, okay, what data are you really using to make the decisions? And I'll tell you this, one of the things that we've seen in practice is that when they make a pool on, let's say, trying to pull your eviction histories, or and the underlying tenant screening application does rely on eviction records. So if that eviction, if for example, a prospective applicant does not have eviction record, because the trained tenant screening application does rely on that field, landlords that are using them, or even some private equity firms that are using them, they are forced to make some assumptions about those records. And the way they go about it largely is about averaging on what they already have. But without really knowing what those underlying data are, there is a limit to what an individual can actually do in terms of like just advocating. So for example, depending on where you are, if you are, for example, in California, Tech Equity Collaborative will really be an organization you want to reach out to once you have a sense of these are the records that are being used to make this decision. If you are in DC, for example, you can reach out to NLIHC and then other organizations that can really help to understand the implications of or the consequences of the underlying records that they are being used to make these decisions. So you're right. Private equity firms, they are heavily invested in this area when it comes to tenant screening applications.
So, thank you, Michael. I see your hand, Charles, but I'm just gonna quickly go to the chat real fast and then I'll come back to you. But I tried to see what type of questions were most common, and I think a lot of the concerns that people were having in the chat had a lot to do around like AI possibly violating privacy. So whether, like, I think you mentioned social media. So how, like, why and how can they do that? Can they include like health information, like substance abuse information or behavioral health information?
Yeah, so if the question is asking that should they include those type of what I'll call privacy intruding records, the answer is absolutely no. Because I'll tell you that if the objective is to understand the risk profile of an applicant, then some of those data points that you mentioned, they are actually not necessary to make that decision. You're trying to understand if somebody poses a credit risk, right? Then the question is, are you getting noise or signals from social media data? Does what I post on my social media platform indicate my ability to make mortgage payments, right? So, I mean, it is not it is not predictive of the objective. Now, like I shared with you, some of those companies that are developing these solutions, they hide under the umbrella of we're trying to predict risk. But the more we dig, the more we learn that what they are truly predicting is profit, their ability to make profit. And now I also like to share this, and this is coming from the work we're doing at NAFRN. There is a tension, and is a real tension between privacy and civil rights or principle of discrimination or anti-discrimination. And I'll tell you what that means. So from the work we do earlier on, I shared that there are solutions, algorithmic solutions that could be adopted in addition to policy recommendations to remove bias from AI systems. Now, what we know for a fact is that some data, you need access to some data that may qualify as personal data for you to, for example, understand if your system, tenant screening application, is disproportionately impacting tenants. Now, in housing, at the federal level, because I think it varies even at the states, but at the federal level, for example, race is a protected class. If I want to assess if my tenant screening application is disproportionately impacting African Americans compared to white, for example, I can only make that decision if I have access to that race data. Now, if you had 6 other protected classes together, and I also know, let's say, your address or your zip code, chances are that I'll be able to identify you as an individual. So even though I need access to these some of them personally identifiable information so that I can remove bias from the system, at the same time, I need to make sure that I'm doing that response. And that's really the tension between privacy and the need to act to remove bias from the system. But the good thing is there are also policy frameworks, guidance that could be adopted to really make sure that only those who need to have access to those type of data so that they can make the right decision, have access to it. And you only have access to it if it will further the objective of removing bias from the system. But we never, and we would not even advocate for using things like social media data or eviction records that are dated, or criminal records that are also dated, which have been shown to be non-predictive of the true credit risk that should be of interest to the landlords.
So, thank you, Michael, again. Charles will take your question and then we'll see if we have time for one more after that, but we'll probably wrap up at the hour.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Unfairness or bias can manifest itself in different ways. So with AI or algorithms, is the greatest challenge in the mindset or the bias of the person who's creating it, or it's in the records or data used in the machine learning?
I really like your question. So I'll say this. Let me say that before we even focus on AI, one question I always like to ask, especially in housing, is that we need to, the question is there any of these problems that we're thinking about or talking about, like bias, discrimination, that was actually not created by us humans historically, right? And then when you think about the history behind the data, the roles that even government, some realtors have played, that will also at least help us to check some assumptions. But specifically when it comes to AI or algorithmic systems, so the other time I mentioned 4 components, right? I said the data, the algorithm or the model. And I also talked about the infrastructure, right? Like the compute resources. And I also talked about the users. And now, if we want to talk about the sources of bias or discrimination, it makes sense to look at it from those 4 angles. The data is one of the major sources of bias or discrimination. Now, people that develop these systems often say that data is always objective, but I'll tell you that data is not always objective. It's just a representation of what we want to measure or what we think is indicative of the risk we're trying to predict. And there is a lot of considerations that go into what variable, what factor or record you want to use to make that prediction. So first, you have to decide the objective, the problem you're trying to solve. That even requires a lot of considerations, back and forth between different teams or divisions. And once you even decide the problem, let's say it's credit risk, or sometimes they even talk about profit, you also need to make a lot of decisions about the data. And those considerations, they are usually not objective. In fact, most of the time they're subjective. And that's why you already have you have data that is just mirroring or reflecting the history, the past history of discrimination, even ongoing discrimination. But the humans that are making decisions about what data to use to develop the tenant screening applications, they're also bringing in their own subjective decisions. So that's one way that data could be an issue. Now, so let's even say that we have perfect data, which again, it's rare to come by in this time and age. Especially, I'll give you one concrete example. We know that at the federal level, there are different agencies now that are even pulling down data from their website, right? So if you have some component of your model that depend on this once publicly available data, you could imagine that next year, if you want to update or rebuild that system, because the data is no longer publicly available, you cannot have quality or complete data again. But let's say for a moment, you have perfect records, perfect data. Now, on the algorithm side, we need to make some assumptions about the signals that the algorithm needs to identify in the data, how the algorithm is actually trained. Now, I know that for some of us, like in high schools, we always think that math is objective, but I'll tell you that math, again, is a symbolic representation of human thoughts. So you could see a lot of symbols and all that. And I know this so well because, again, like I shared with you, my degree is in math. So you still need to make some assumptions and you represent them in symbol. So the learning algorithm is another possible source of bias or discrimination. And the last one that I like to share which relies on the user. When I was talking about AI trust or public trust, there are different categories of users. Your landlord, for example, is using the algorithmic system. So your landlord is a user. Now, because your landlord does not have full sense, does not have transparency into the data or even the algorithms, how it's making the decision, he or she only has partial observation, which is the final outcome. And the landlord is also approaching this as a user from his or her own incentives, right? So based on that, the decisions that the user is also going to make or the policies that they are making to override or to interpret how they want to use the outcome is another source. So those are the three major sources of bias in the system: the data, the algorithm, the math or the model, and also how the end user is interpreting the outcome. If the system makes a recommendation, usually the system, the output is in the range of 0 to 1. And it will be the responsibility of the user, in this case, landlord, to translate that number into a threshold that they want to use to make approve, deny decision. So that process of creating the threshold usually could be another source of bias. And Charles.
So when you say structure, is that what you mean by structure and the way that they decide to train the
Yes, yeah,
machine?
exactly. So the way they decide to train it, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. I see we have another hand up, but unfortunately we're at time for today. But thank you, Charles, for your question, and thank you everybody else who asked the question. You can feel free to email me, but Michael, if you want to drop your email in the chat too, if you feel comfortable doing so. If not, I'll just follow up with the questions afterwards. But thank you again for joining.
Absolutely. I'm going to drop it. It's just my initial last name and National Fair Housing Alliance. So I'm dropping that right now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. So thank you everybody for joining us. I'll just wrap this up. Our next call will be on June 2nd at 6 p.m. Eastern time, as always. And if you want to register, we'll drop that link in the chat for you. And don't forget to join our Facebook group so y'all can connect with one another and continue talking about this. But I am taking note that there were a lot of questions and there was a lot of interest. So hopefully we'll be able to talk about this in other spaces as well. But thank you everybody again for taking the time, and we'll talk later.
All right. Thank you.